Maria sat in her office late one evening, her desk covered with papers, files, and her laptop screen still glowing with unfinished work. She was used to long hours. Building her company had never been easy. From the small garage where she started with nothing but determination, to the tall glass office she now worked in, every step had cost her sleepless nights and endless effort. She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her tired eyes, when her assistant entered the room with a golden envelope. "This just came for you," the assistant said softly, placing the envelope on her desk. Maria opened it carefully. The envelope itself was heavy, the kind of stationery that signaled wealth and status. Inside was an invitation written in shining gold letters: "You are cordially invited to the annual Clarion Hotel's banquet, hosted by Helen Clarion." For a moment, Maria could not believe her eyes. The Clarion Hotel's banquet was one of the most exclusive events of the year. Only the most powerful business leaders, social figures, and investors were ever invited. For years, Maria had heard about the event but never imagined her name would be on the guest list. She read the invitation twice more, her heart beating faster. This was not just a dinner. This was recognition. This was a sign that her work was finally being noticed in circles that had always seemed closed to her. Maria walked over to the tall window of her office and looked out at the city lights. She thought about the long journey that had brought her here. She remembered the times when she had been told her ideas were too big, her dreams too unrealistic. She remembered the banks that had refused her loans, the investors who had doubted her, the colleagues who had laughed at her plans. And now, she was holding an invitation to one of the most prestigious banquets in the business world. The next few days were filled with preparation. Maria was not someone who cared much about fashion, but she knew this event would be different. She visited a small boutique owned by a friend and chose a simple yet elegant black gown. It was not flashy, but it reflected her personality: calm, confident, and timeless. On the evening of the banquet, Maria arrived at the Clarion Grand Hotel, a building famous for its shining chandeliers and marble floors. The hotel stood tall against the night sky, its name glowing brightly across the street. Cars lined up outside, dropping off guests dressed in glittering gowns and sharp suits. Maria stepped out of her car and felt the cool night air brush against her face. For a moment, she hesitated at the entrance. She knew she was walking into a world where people might see her as an outsider. But she also knew that she had earned her place. Straightening her shoulders, she walked inside. The lobby was filled with golden light and soft music. Waiters moved gracefully with trays of sparkling drinks. Guests gathered in groups, laughing, shaking hands, exchanging greetings that sounded more like business deals than conversations. Maria walked slowly, observing the grand paintings on the walls, the polished floors that reflected every step, and the air of luxury that filled the space. When she entered the ballroom, she felt dozens of eyes turned toward her. Some faces showed curiosity, others surprise, and a few carried that quiet doubt she had seen before, the look that asked, "Does she really belong here?" Maria kept her expression calm, though inside her chest her heart raced. She found her seat at one of the large round tables covered in white silk cloths and crystal glasses. Around her sat business leaders, investors, and socialites, each one speaking as if their words carried the weight of power. As she listened to their conversations, Maria felt both out of place and determined. She knew her journey had been different. She had not inherited wealth or privilege. She had built her company from the ground up, piece by piece, struggle by struggle. And now, sitting here, she promised herself she would not let their glances shake her. The program began with speeches, music, and applause. Maria clapped politely, though her mind wandered. She wondered if anyone here truly saw her, or if she was just another guest filling a seat. Yet deep inside, she felt something important. She had stepped into a world that once felt unreachable. And though the night was only beginning, Maria did not know that this banquet would become a turning point in her life. A night that would test her dignity, her patience, and her vision. For now, as she raised her glass with the others, she carried only quiet hope. Hope that this evening would open doors. Hope that she would be judged not by whispers or glances, but by the strength of her journey. But life had other plans. The banquet hall glittered with lights, laughter, and music. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above, their soft glow reflecting across polished marble floors. The tables were set with silver cutlery and plates that looked more like art than dinnerware. Every detail was designed to impress. Maria sat quietly at her table, surrounded by people who seemed to know one another very well. She smiled politely when spoken to, but she was not part of their inner circle. Around her, conversations flowed like a private stream where every word carried weight. People talked about new business deals, family names, and vacations in faraway places. Maria sipped her water and kept listening. She did not try to force her way into their talks. Instead, she observed, her calm nature guiding her. She had always believed that listening revealed more than speaking. Still, she could not ignore the small glances that kept coming her way, glances that questioned, that measured, that judged. At the center of the hall stood Helen Clarion, the heiress of Clarion Hotels. She was tall, graceful, and confident. Wearing a silver gown that shimmered under the chandeliers, Helen moved from group to group like a queen greeting her court. People leaned in when she spoke, laughed at her light remarks, and complimented her as though her presence alone was a gift. When it was time for the speeches, the host announced Helen. The room filled with applause as she walked onto the stage, her smile wide and proud. Maria clapped with the rest, her face calm though her thoughts were uncertain. She wanted this night to be a new step in her journey, a door opening. Helen began her speech with warm greetings, thanking the guests for attending and praising her family's legacy in the hotel industry. She spoke of tradition, elegance, and the importance of maintaining the Clarion image. Her voice carried the smooth tone of someone used to being admired. But then, her words shifted. Of course, Helen said, her smile still fixed, every year we welcome new faces. Some of them belong, and some of them, well, they remind us that not everyone is ready to carry the weight of this legacy. The room grew quiet for a moment. A few guests exchanged looks. Helen's eyes scanned the hall and landed briefly on Maria. It was only for a second, but it was enough. The suggestion hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore. Maria felt the shift immediately. Though Helen had not spoken her name, everyone seemed to understand the unspoken message. A few whispers rose at the tables. Some people glanced at Maria, quickly turning back as though they had seen something they were not supposed to see. Helen continued, her voice smooth as silk. We believe in excellence. We believe in history. And we believe in an image that reflects who we are. Again, her eyes brushed past Maria, this time more slowly. Then Helen laughed lightly, and a ripple of polite laughter followed across the hall. Maria's cheeks warmed, but she did not bow her head. She sat straight, her hands folded gently in her lap. Inside, however, she felt a heavy stone drop in her heart. She had faced doubt before. She had been told she did not belong in boardrooms, that her dreams were too ambitious. But standing alone in her office, she had always had the freedom to fight back, to prove herself with action. Tonight was different. Tonight, she was being tested in front of hundreds of eyes. The speech ended with applause. People clapped eagerly, some standing to show their loyalty to the clarion name. Maria clapped too, her hands moving slowly, carefully, though her mind was far away. As the music started again and dinner was served, the atmosphere shifted. A few people tried to greet Maria politely, but their smiles felt thin, their words felt empty. Others avoided her table altogether, as if sitting near her might cast a shadow on their own status. Maria picked at her food, not tasting a bite. She looked around the hall and saw the golden walls, the polished chandeliers, the shimmering gowns. It was beautiful, but it did not feel like beauty to her. It felt like a hall of mirrors where everyone was busy watching their own reflection. Her thoughts returned to her mother's words, "Don't fight in their halls, build your own." That voice came back to her stronger than ever. She realized she had no reason to beg for a place where she was only tolerated. She was not here to prove herself to people who measured worth by last names or inherited wealth. Maria placed her fork down gently and smiled to herself. It was not a smile of joy, but of clarity. She had been humiliated tonight, but she would not let this define her. The very insult that was meant to break her would instead become her motivation. The music swelled, glasses clinked, and laughter filled the air again. No one noticed when Maria stood and quietly walked out of the hall. No one saw her step into the cool night air, where the stars above shone brighter than the chandeliers she had left behind. But Maria knew. She knew this night had changed her path forever. The banquet was meant to remind her of her limits, but instead, it had lit a fire in her heart. A fire that would grow, and one day, burn brighter than the clarion name itself. Maria's car moved slowly through the city streets that night. The lights of the banquet hall faded behind her, but the weight of the evening still pressed on her shoulders. She leaned back in her seat, staring out the window at the glowing skyline. To the world outside, it was just another night, but to her, it felt like a turning point she could not yet explain. Her driver glanced in the mirror, waiting for her to speak, but Maria said nothing. Her silence was not weakness. It was the silence of someone thinking deeply, someone shaping an answer not with words, but with resolve. When she reached her apartment, she stepped out quietly and thanked the driver. Inside, the apartment was simple despite her success: bookshelves filled with notes and journals, photographs of her parents, and plants by the windows. She took off her gown, laid it carefully on a chair, and stood in front of the mirror. Her reflection looked calm, but she could still hear Helen's voice echoing in her ears. The words had been carefully chosen, polite on the surface, but sharp underneath. They were designed to remind her she was not part of their circle, not part of their history. For a moment, Maria felt the sting again, but then she whispered to herself, "This does not decide who I am." She walked to the small framed photo of her mother on the shelf. Her mother had passed away years ago, but her wisdom lived on in Maria's heart. "Don't fight in their halls, build your own." Those words came back now, stronger than ever. Maria sat down at her desk and opened a notebook. She did not write business plans that night. Instead, she wrote a promise to herself. A promise that she would not waste her energy trying to be accepted where she was not wanted. A promise that she would build something so strong, so undeniable, that no one could ever try to make her feel small again. The next morning, Maria woke early. The sun filled her apartment with soft golden light, and she felt renewed. She went for a walk in the park nearby, watching children play and families gather. Life went on, simple and pure, far from the world of banquets and whispered judgments. As she walked, Maria thought about her journey. She had faced rejection before, but every time she had turned it into fuel. The banks that had closed their doors on her had taught her to manage money with discipline. The investors who had laughed at her had taught her the value of believing in her own vision. The competitors who had tried to outshine her had only pushed her to innovate more boldly. This banquet would be no different. It was not an end. It was a spark. Back in her office later that day, her team greeted her cheerfully. They did not know what had happened the night before, and Maria chose not to tell them. She would not let the insult define the story of her company. Instead, she walked among them with quiet strength, asking about projects, offering guidance, and reminding them of their shared vision. Still, deep inside, something had shifted. Maria began studying the hotel industry with new eyes. The banquet had not just humiliated her, it had revealed something important. She realized that the world Helen protected so fiercely was actually fragile. The hotel industry was old, slow to change, still relying on tradition more than innovation. Maria saw opportunity. Her technology company had already been building tools for travel and booking systems, but now she saw a bigger picture. What if she could transform hospitality itself? What if she could make hotels smarter, faster, more connected to the future? That night, she stayed in her office long after her team had left. She drew diagrams, made notes, and mapped out ideas. Every stroke of her pen was steady. She was not driven by anger but by vision. She understood that the best answer to disrespect was not revenge, it was success that no one could ignore. Weeks passed, and Maria kept working quietly. She met with partners, studied reports, and watched the movements of the big hotel groups. She noticed how dependent they were on old systems, how investors were beginning to look for fresher, more innovative ideas. Maria smiled to herself. Helen had tried to make her feel small, but in doing so, she had revealed a path Maria might not have seen otherwise. Sometimes, life's sharpest moments carried the clearest lessons. At the end of one long day, Maria stood by her window, looking out at the city lights once again. This time, she did not feel weighed down. She felt ready. She thought of her mother, of the garage where her dreams had started, of every door that had been shut in her face. Silent strength, she whispered softly. That's my answer. The banquet had been Helen's stage, but the world was bigger than one ballroom. And Maria was no longer trying to enter someone else's hall. She was building her own, brick by brick, vision by vision. Little did anyone know, this quiet strength would soon grow into a move so bold it would shake the very legacy that once tried to dismiss her. Maria's days began to look different after the banquet. She was no longer just leading her company, she was planning something bigger, something that even she had not imagined before. The sting of that night had turned into a spark, and the spark had grown into a fire of vision. She spent long hours in her office, surrounded by documents, reports, and glowing computer screens. Her team noticed the change. She was more focused, quieter, but her eyes carried a determination that inspired everyone. Whenever she spoke, her words were measured, but behind them was a sense of direction that no one could ignore. Maria had built her technology company on efficiency and trust. At first, it had been a small business developing simple booking software for small hotels and travel agencies. But now, she saw a much larger opportunity. The banquet had shown her the weakness of old traditions. The hotel industry, proud of its history, had failed to adapt to the modern world. Guests wanted speed, simplicity, and technology. But the big hotel groups were still living in the past. Maria decided she would not wait for their approval. She would build something that could not be ignored. Her first step was research. For weeks, she read through reports on the global hotel industry. She studied the patterns of travelers, the needs of modern guests, and the gaps that traditional hotels had failed to fill. She saw how younger travelers used apps for everything: booking, dining, entertainment. She saw how independent hotels struggled because they could not keep up with the big chains. And she realized that technology could be the bridge. Maria called her senior team into the boardroom one morning. The room was bright with sunlight, and her team sat waiting, curious about what she would say. "I know we've been building strong tools for booking systems," Maria began, her voice calm but firm. "But it's time to think bigger. What if we don't just support hotels? What if we transform them? What if our technology becomes the heart of the hospitality world?" Her team exchanged surprised glances. One of them asked, "Do you mean partnering with hotels directly?" Maria nodded. "Not just partnering. Acquiring. We will bring technology and hospitality together. We'll show the world that the future does not belong to tradition alone. It belongs to innovation." The room was silent for a moment. Then one by one, her team nodded, their faces lighting with excitement. They trusted her vision, and they were ready to follow. The next weeks were filled with meetings. Maria began speaking with two technology-driven hotel companies that were struggling financially but had strong systems in place. They were not as famous as Clarion Hotels, but they had potential. Their founders were open to her ideas, and soon, discussions turned into negotiations. Maria was patient but firm. She showed them how combining their systems with her company's resources could create something powerful. She spoke with clarity, not rushing the process, but guiding it carefully like a skilled navigator. Within months, Maria's company announced the acquisition of both firms. The news spread quickly across business journals and financial networks. Headlines read, "Maria Daniels expands into hospitality tech with billion-dollar acquisitions." Investors took notice. Analysts who once doubted her began to write articles praising her boldness. But Maria did not celebrate publicly. She simply returned to work, knowing this was only the beginning. The acquisitions gave her more than just new technology. They gave her credibility in the hospitality world. Suddenly, investors who had only looked at old hotel chains began to see Maria as a leader of the future. She began receiving invitations not to banquets that flaunted tradition, but to conferences that discussed innovation, growth, and change. Meanwhile, Maria watched Clarion Hotels carefully. She saw how they clung to their legacy, how they continued to speak about elegance and image, but ignored the shifting demands of the market. She noticed how slowly they moved, how much they resisted change. And she knew exactly where to aim her next move. Quietly, she began reaching out to Clarion's investors. Not with promises of revenge, but with numbers, reports, and visions of the future. She showed them how her new systems could improve profit margins, how her approach could win younger travelers, and how innovation could ensure long-term growth. At first, some investors were polite but doubtful. Clarion was an old name, and tradition had a strong hold on them. But Maria never pushed. She let the results speak. Month by month, her company grew stronger. Revenues rose, customer satisfaction increased, and her brand gained respect. Slowly, the investors began to listen more closely. They began to see that while Clarion was holding on to the past, Maria was opening doors to the future. One by one, their loyalty shifted. Maria did not rush. She had learned long ago that strength was not in loud words but in steady action. Each step she took was careful, strategic, and deliberate. At night, when she returned home, she sometimes thought back to the banquet. She remembered Helen's smile, the way the words had been thrown so smoothly, so confidently. But instead of bitterness, Maria now felt gratitude. That moment of humiliation had forced her to look beyond her comfort, to dream bigger than she had ever dreamed before. Her bold move had begun not with anger, but with vision. And the world was beginning to see it. What no one knew was that this was only the first strike of change. The legacy of Clarion, which once seemed untouchable, was slowly beginning to feel the ground shift beneath it. The news of Maria's acquisitions spread like ripples in a pond. At first, people only whispered about it in business circles. Some called it risky. Others said it was clever. But as the months passed, the whispers grew louder, and soon, her name was on every major business headline. Maria Daniels redefines hospitality with technology, one article wrote. The future of hotels may belong to innovation, not tradition, another declared. Investors who once looked only at Clarion hotels now studied Maria's reports carefully. They saw how her systems were improving efficiency in the hotels she had partnered with. They saw higher occupancy rates, smoother guest experiences, and stronger profits. Numbers did not lie, and the numbers told a story of growth. Meanwhile, Clarion Hotels continued with its usual ways. They hosted their grand banquets, spoke of elegance and heritage, and filled magazines with glossy pictures of their ballrooms. But while their image remained polished, their profits were slowly slipping. Younger travelers were no longer drawn to the same old traditions. They wanted ease, speed, and smart technology, things Clarion had been slow to provide. Maria did not celebrate loudly. She never boasted or spoke against Clarion in public. Instead, she worked quietly, letting her results speak for her. Every improvement her company introduced spread quickly, adopted by more hotels eager to compete in the changing world. One evening, as she sat in her office reviewing reports, her financial advisor entered with a smile. "Maria," he said, placing a file on her desk, "you should see this." Maria opened the file and saw a list of investors who had begun shifting their funds from Clarion into her ventures. Some were small investors, but others were large and influential. It was not a flood, but it was the beginning of something powerful. She looked up at her advisor, her calm expression unchanged, though her eyes carried a spark. "This is only the start," she said softly. Across the city, inside the Clarion Hotel headquarters, Helen sat in a grand office decorated with portraits of her ancestors. For years, the Clarion name had stood as a symbol of luxury and pride. She had always believed that legacy was enough to secure their place at the top. But now, reports crossed her desk that showed a different story. Occupancy rates were dropping. Younger investors were asking questions. Guests were choosing newer hotels that offered better digital services. And the name that kept appearing in every report was Maria's. Helen frowned but dismissed it with a wave of her hand. "She is just a newcomer," she told her team. "This will pass." But even as she said the words, a seed of doubt grew quietly inside her. Back in Maria's world, momentum was building. She was invited to speak at conferences, not about tradition, but about innovation. She stood on stages with bright lights and told audiences about the future of hospitality. She spoke in simple, clear words: hospitality is not just about chandeliers and marble floors. It is about people. It is about meeting their needs with care and efficiency. Technology is not the enemy of tradition, it is the bridge to a better experience. Her words were quoted in newspapers and shared across social media. Young entrepreneurs admired her, and seasoned investors respected her clarity. Slowly, Maria's image grew not as a guest in someone else's hall, but as a leader in her own right. Months turned into a year. Maria's company grew stronger. The hotels she had acquired were thriving. New partnerships formed. More investors moved their support from Clarion to her ventures. The tide was turning, and though it moved slowly, it was steady, unstoppable. Maria often thought back to the banquet. She remembered how Helen had smiled as she spoke words that carried hidden edges. That memory no longer stung. Instead, it reminded her how far she had come. One night, as she stood by her window looking at the city lights, Maria whispered to herself, "This is not about revenge. This is about building something better." Her silent strength had become bold action, and now her bold action was reshaping an entire industry. The legacy of Clarion, once untouchable, was now facing cracks in its walls. And while Helen tried to hold her ground with pride, Maria was rising higher with vision and resilience. The tide had turned. The future was no longer waiting for tradition. It was already walking toward innovation, and Maria was leading the way. And though she knew there were greater challenges ahead, she also knew something else: nothing could silence the voice of progress. The Clarion Grand Hotel ballroom, once the heart of luxury and pride, no longer carried the same shine. The chandeliers still sparkled, the tables were still dressed in silk, and the music still played softly, but something was missing. The air no longer held the same energy it once did. It was the night of the annual Clarion banquet. Helen had prepared as she always did, with her silver gown, her practiced smile, and her long speech about elegance and heritage. But as she looked around the room, she saw the truth written in empty spaces. Half the tables were unoccupied. Investors who once rushed to be seen here were absent. Some had politely declined, and others had quietly disappeared, their money now flowing into Maria's ventures. Helen forced her smile to stay steady, but inside, her heart felt heavy. For the first time, she realized that her family's legacy was not as untouchable as she had always believed. Meanwhile, across town, another event was happening. Maria was hosting her first Global Innovation Summit. It was not set in a golden ballroom, but in a modern convention hall filled with light, energy, and hope. Business leaders from across industries gathered there, not to boast of tradition, but to share ideas for the future. The room was alive with excitement, filled with people who once felt excluded by the narrow walls of old banquets. Maria stood on stage in a simple suit, not a glittering gown, and spoke with calm strength. "The future is not built by names or by legacy alone," she said. "It is built by vision, by courage, and by the willingness to change. Tonight, we are not just talking about hotels. We are talking about building spaces where people feel seen, valued, and respected." Her words brought applause that echoed through the hall. The audience leaned in, hungry for her message. It was clear Maria's voice carried more weight now than Helen's polished speeches ever had. Back at the Clarion banquet, Helen began her address. She stood at the podium, her hands holding the notes she had prepared, but her voice felt weaker than before. She spoke about heritage, about tradition, about her family's place in history. But as she looked around, she saw distracted faces, polite claps, and eyes that were not truly listening. For years, people had admired her because of her last name. But now, she could feel it: admiration was slipping away. Investors were more interested in growth than in old stories. Guests were comparing her grand halls to Maria's modern success. And some, she noticed, were whispering Maria's name even as she spoke. The weight of that realization pressed on Helen's chest. She finished her speech quickly and returned to her seat, her smile hiding the storm inside. Days later, the reports came in. Attendance at the banquet had been the lowest in its history. Media outlets compared the dull banquet to Maria's bright summit. Headlines read, "Maria Daniels redefines the future while Clarion holds onto the past." Helen sat in her office, staring at the articles spread across her desk. She tried to dismiss them, but the truth was undeniable. Investors were leaving. Guests were leaving. Even employees were beginning to look for opportunities elsewhere. The Clarion name, once strong enough to open any door, was losing its power. And the name that replaced it everywhere was Maria's. Maria, however, did not focus on Helen's loss. She focused on growth. She expanded her partnerships, launched new projects, and continued to speak about innovation. She welcomed not only investors but also young entrepreneurs, independent hotel owners, and anyone willing to embrace change. Her success was not built on shutting others out, it was built on bringing people in. This difference was clear to everyone. While Helen clung tightly to her shrinking circle, Maria kept opening hers wider. And that was why the tide could not be stopped. One evening, Maria sat in her office, reviewing the latest financial reports. Her advisor smiled as he placed the document on her desk. "Maria," he said, "we've crossed the mark. Investors have pulled nearly $5 billion from Clarion and moved it into your projects." Maria's eyes stayed calm, though her heart felt a quiet victory. She nodded, closing the file. "Thank you," she said simply. It was not about numbers to her. It was about meaning. She remembered that night at the banquet, the laughter, the whispers, and the sting of Helen's words. And now, without shouting, without fighting, she had changed the story. Clarion's legacy, once held like a crown, was crumbling piece by piece. And Maria had built her own legacy not with pride, but with vision, humility, and resilience. In the weeks that followed, Helen tried everything. She arranged new campaigns, promised reforms, and called on loyal investors. But it was too late. The foundation of her empire had already cracked. The world had turned its eyes elsewhere. Maria had not just entered the world of hospitality. She had reshaped it. And as the Clarion banquet halls grew quieter, Maria's summit halls grew brighter. The collapse of one legacy had become the rise of another. The city skyline gleamed under the late afternoon sun as Maria stood by the window of her office. She watched the streets below, filled with people going about their lives, unaware that a quiet revolution in hospitality had already taken place. Her company had grown beyond what she had imagined even a year ago. Hotels were thriving under her technology-driven systems. Investors praised her vision, and young entrepreneurs sought her guidance. Yet Maria's greatest satisfaction was not in wealth or recognition. It was in knowing that her work had created opportunities for others who had been overlooked. She remembered her own journey, starting with nothing, facing rejection, and persevering when everyone else doubted her. That journey was now a bridge for countless others, a path paved with possibilities. The final banquet of Clarion Hotels was held in silence, with far fewer guests than before. The grand halls that once vibrated with music and laughter now felt heavy and empty. Helen, still dressed in silver, stood at the podium. She delivered her speech as she always had, speaking of tradition and legacy. But the applause was polite, brief, and lacked the warmth it once carried. Maria did not attend. She did not need to. She had already surpassed the world that had once tried to humiliate her. Her presence no longer relied on approval from others, it was defined by her own accomplishments and integrity. Instead, Maria hosted the Global Innovation Summit that very week, inviting leaders from technology, hospitality, and business to discuss growth, progress, and collaboration. The energy in the hall was electric. Unlike Clarion's banquet, which had been about appearances, Maria's summit was about ideas. People from diverse backgrounds shared their visions, and Maria listened carefully, guiding the discussion with calm authority. Success, Maria said as she addressed the audience, is not about who has the oldest name or the largest building. It is about solving problems, lifting others, and creating opportunities that last. When we focus on vision instead of pride, we can achieve more than we ever imagined. Applause echoed through the hall. She looked out over the audience and saw hope in their eyes. That hope was her true victory. Back in her office, later that evening, Maria reflected on the journey that had led her here. She remembered the banquet, the cold stares, the whispers, the subtle humiliation. Those moments had been painful, but they had also been necessary. They had taught her patience, focus, and the power of quiet resilience. Her mind wandered back to Helen. Maria did not feel anger. She did not feel the need for revenge. What had happened was bigger than either of them. It was about change. Helen's empire had been built on tradition, on pride, and on inherited status. Maria's empire was built on vision, on courage, and on persistence. The contrast could not have been clearer. It was then that Maria realized the true meaning of victory. It was not in defeating someone else. It was in proving, to herself and to the world, that perseverance, intelligence, and integrity could create something lasting. The $5 billion she had drawn from investors was only a number. The real achievement was the trust she had earned and the doors she had opened for others. In the weeks that followed, Maria continued to expand her influence. Her company introduced new technologies, streamlined hotel operations, and created experiences that delighted guests. Investors flocked to partner with her ventures. But more importantly, Maria inspired others to dream bigger, to challenge limitations, and to act with dignity. One quiet morning, Maria stood on the balcony of her office, looking at the rising sun. She thought about the years of struggle, the nights spent working in her small garage, and the moments of doubt that had once clouded her vision. She smiled. Every obstacle, every insult, every challenge had led her here. She knew that some people would always cling to the past, to traditions that no longer served the future. That was fine. The world, she realized, would always change. And those who embraced change, as she had, would shape the path ahead. Maria's victory was not only personal. It was symbolic. It showed that courage, intelligence, and persistence could challenge even the most established powers. It proved that dignity and vision were stronger than pride or inherited status. And most importantly, it showed that real success was measured not by applause or banquets, but by the positive impact one left behind. Years later, when people spoke of the banquet where Maria was once humiliated, they did not remember the insult. They remembered the comeback. They remembered a woman who had transformed rejection into opportunity, who had built her empire with care, patience, and vision, and who had changed an entire industry. Maria's story became a lesson for generations, proof that no obstacle is too great, no insult too sharp, and no system too rigid when one has determination, intelligence, and the courage to act. And as Maria looked out over the city, she knew one thing clearly: this was only the beginning. The legacy she had built would last far beyond any banquet, any name, or any building. It was a legacy of vision, strength, and integrity, the kind of legacy that could never be shaken.